let me introduce our speaker tonight. You can see him on your screen with a vast library behind him, it looks like. Our speaker is Mike Hemingway. Let me just make an introduction here. He was born in Salt Lake City. Growing up, he lived in Utah and in London, England, where his father worked for the U.S. Air Force. He served a 2-year mission in the California North Mission, graduated from BYU with a degree in communications, and has worked as a newspaper writer, television producer, and director, and as the director of media and the director of proselyting for the missionary department of the church. He's a student of history, particularly studies and researches early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's had the privilege of serving with his wife as mission leaders. Now, today, what we used to call the mission president and the mission president's wife, today we call mission leaders. That's our new terminology. So they were the mission leaders in the New York Rochester mission, of course, where the early church sites are located, many of them. After he's retired, he and his wife served in San Diego, where he was the director of the Mormon Battalion Historic Site. So that's his connection. Mike and his wife, Leanne, have 6 children, 24 grandchildren who keep them busy. That last sentence, as we all know at our age, is the most important part of our lives, isn't it? Well, Mike, let me turn it over to you and your discussion tonight for us of Jesse C. Little. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. I'm happy to see that President and Sister Allen have joined us from the Mormon Battalion Historic Site today. So it's good to see them again, and they're doing a fabulous job down there. Let me share my screen with you, and we'll get started. Little, is that right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. Then we can go. Before I start, let me first of all say I'm grateful for this opportunity to visit with you. I have a great love for the Mormon Battalion and the men that were in it. And just in terms of sources where I drew this information from, I used the Church History Archives online, the Diary of James K. Polk, which is available online, Family Search, and then also the Comprehensive History of the Church by B.H. Roberts. So those are the major places that I looked. And when I thought about Jesse Little, I thought it's probably best to look at his life in a chronological order, particularly as we get down to the parts that apply to the Mormon Battalion. So I apologize if you've seen some of this before, but hopefully there'll be some things in here that will be of interest to you. So Jesse Little was born on September 26, 1815 in Belmont, Maine. He married Eliza Greenwood French on September 29th in 1840 in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And together they had 11 children. Now, apparently he had a successful carriage business that he ran there in New Hampshire. He was baptized on April 3rd, 1842 by Elder Eli P. Magan in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and he was age 26. Now, if you go to Family Search, you'll find that they have a different date for his baptism. But this baptism date was taken from a letter that he wrote to Andrew Jensen when he talked about, this is the date I was baptized in, and this is who baptized me. So I used that date. On January 26, 1846, he was called as the president of the Eastern States Mission. And his letter of appointment came from, and I thought this was interesting, the Temple of God, Nauvoo. And he was age 30 at the time he had been called, and had only been a member of the church about 4 years. So pretty significant calling for him. Now, in his call letter, there's an interesting paragraph that was put there by the brother. And in his call letter, it says, if our government shall offer any facilities for emigrating to the Western coast, embrace these facilities, if possible. As a wise and faithful man, take every honorable advantage of the times you can. Now, you look at that date, you realize that January 26th was right before they began to leave Nauvoo. In fact, they left on February 4th, 1846, is when the first saints crossed the Mississippi River to begin their trek west. When Elder Little received this letter, he later wrote to Brigham Young and told him in his report, he said, following the instructions in his call letter, Elder Little would later report to Brigham Young, in consonance of my instructions, I felt an anxious desire for the deliverance of the saints and resolved upon visiting James K. Polk, President of the United States, to lay the situation of the persecuted brethren before him and ask him, as the representative of our country, to stretch forth the federal arm on our behalf. I think it's interesting that he talked about an anxious desire. We would sometimes say he was prompted to visit James K. Polk. And here's the 30-year-old young man going to Washington to see the president. Now think about that in today's term and think how difficult that would be. But in his day, people could go in and visit with the president. So he started to gather letters of introduction for his trip to Washington. Now you have to remember, they didn't have telephones, they didn't have the telegraph, they didn't have instant messaging or email or any of the things that we look at. And so the way that you introduce somebody is you got a letter of introduction. And then when you met them, you would say, here's a letter of introduction of who I am. And so he got a letter of introduction from the governor of New Hampshire, who was John H. Steele, who was a boyhood friend. He also got another one from a businessman. And then on his journey, he stopped in New York and met A.G. Benson, who gave him a letter of introduction to Amos Kendall, a former United States Postmaster General. Now, A.G. Benson knew Sam Brannan. In fact, he'd gotten Sam Brannan to sign a contract with him. A.G. Benson had convinced Brannan that the government was not going to let them leave on a boat and would probably stop the saints from leaving the country, and assured him that if he would sign this contract, that they would use their political influence to help the saints in their emigration. Now, B.H. Roberts suggests that Amos Kendall was a silent partner in A.G. Benson's business. Now, what they agreed to was that for every section of land that the Mormons settled, A.G. Benson got a section of land. And so it even says in the contract down to, if you settle a city, for every lot that the Mormons settle on, A.G. Benson gets a lot. So they were giving away half of all that they were doing, that they were settling based on this contract. Well, Brannan signed the contract and sent it off to Brigham Young, and apparently it had not come back from Brigham Young, and so I'm sure that Benson and Amos Kendall were trying to get some good favor from Brigham Young in hopes that he would agree to the contract. On May 9th, then, of 1846, President James K. Polk received word that the Mexican army had crossed the Rio Grande River and attacked American forces. And on May 13th, 1846, the United States officially declared war with Mexico. So that's the situation that Jesse Little is going into as he goes into Washington, D.C. Just so happens that on May 13th, the same day that they declared war, Elder Little held a conference of the saints in Philadelphia. And in that conference, he met Colonel Thomas L. Kane, who came to the conference out of curiosity. This is the first introduction of Thomas L. Kane to the church. And one of the most significant things of this trip was this relationship that he built with Thomas L. Kane. And Colonel Kane gave him a letter of introduction to the Honorable George M. Dallas, the Vice President of the United States, another letter of introduction to help him as he gets into Washington. Elder Little arrived in Washington on May 21st, so 175 years ago tomorrow is the day that he arrived in Washington, D.C. So we're talking about the very time, and we're living at the same time of the year as these great events took place. He called on Amos Kendall, who was sick, so he didn't have a chance to meet with him. On May 22nd, Little attended a reception in the evening and was introduced to President Polk. Now, Polk in his diary would write, tonight was reception night. And apparently once a week, he would open the White House and anybody who wanted to come and meet him could come. And so he said his meetings were filled with people looking for political appointments or people who wanted to vote or who wanted to participate in the war and all those sorts of things. So Little attended with two other people and apparently met President Polk. Polk just mentioned in his diary that he met a lot of people who were from out of town. On May 23rd, the next day, he again called on Amos Kendall and told him of the saints' immigration, and Kendall thought arrangements could be made to assist the saints. On May 25th, Elder Little again called on Mr. Kendall, hadn't heard anything, and on that same day, President Polk noted in his diary, I had an interview tonight with Mr. Amos Kendall, and Governor Yell of Arkansas on the subject of organizing a military expedition to California. They were both in favor of it. So Kendall had gone and talked to the president and was known by the president. On the 26th, Little met Mr. Kendall on the street, so he didn't have an appointment. They ran into each other, and Kendall told him that he had laid his case before the president. The president said he would lay the subject before the cabinet that day. Now, Polk knew that the cabinet had a long conversation about an expedition against Upper California. So Kendall's at least talked to the president, and Polk is talking to the cabinet. Now, on the 27th, Little again met Kendall, who informed me that the cabinet had not fully decided. The plan was offered for me to go directly to the camp and have 1,000 men fitted out and plunge into California. So that's what Kendall proposed. He also proposed that they would have another 1,000 men outfitted and sent by ship around the Horn to California. Now, if you look at it from the standpoint of Kendall and Benson, what they wanted to do is get as many men out there that were members of the church to settle land, because they got half of everything that was settled. And so they were thinking big. Obviously, that's not what happened, but that's what he had proposed. On the 28th, Polk wrote in his journal, "I had several consultations today with the Secretary of War and some members of Congress concerning the manner of conducting the war with Mexico, and especially about the propriety of setting on foot an expedition to California." So Polk was thinking about, we need to send somebody overland, and was counseling about that. On the 30th, in the cabinet meeting, the campaign against Mexico was discussed. Polk proposed that now we'd say Kearny, and if you go to California, they say it's Kearny Plaza or Kearny Road or all those things, but it's actually pronounced Kearny. Polk proposed that Colonel Kearny should take Santa Fe and lead the expedition to California if he could safely do so before winter. So Polk's made up his mind that he wants Kearny to go to Santa Fe and then on to California. Now on June 1st, Elder Little hasn't heard anything back, so he decided to take the matters in his own hands and wrote an 8-page letter to appeal to the president. If you want to read that letter, it's out there in the church archives. It's in his handwriting, and it's a copy of it, and you can see what he wrote to the president. But in the letter, he says a number of things. Number one, he talks about him being a patriot, and then he talks about the saints and how they're patriotic to the nation. He explains the number of times that they've been driven out. He talks about the martyrdom of the prophet and how they've appealed to the government for help. And then he wrote this paragraph. "They, as well as myself, are true-hearted Americans, true to our country, true to its laws, true to its glorious institutions. And we have a desire to go under the outstretched wings of the American eagle. We would disdain to receive assistance from a foreign power, although it should be proffered, unless our government shall turn us off in this great crisis and not help us, but compel us to be foreigners." I believe that was an inspired statement. What Little may or may not have known is that Polk had not resolved the issue with Oregon, with England, and it was being co-managed by the two of them. About 70% of the converts are from England, and he hits a chord with Polk that if you won't help us, then we're going to have to turn to somebody else for help. So based on that letter, then on June 2nd, Polk met with his cabinet and he recorded the following. "Colonel Kearny was also authorized to receive into the service as volunteers a few hundred of the Mormons who are now on their way to California, with a view to conciliate them, attach them to our country, and prevent them from taking part against us." He's worried that if the Mormons get out there and they're not helping them, then they'll turn against the country. And so he wants them to join the army. Now it's interesting, that's on June 2nd. On June 2nd, that same day, Amos Kendall came to Elder Little and told him the president had received his letter and wanted to meet him the next day at noon, accompanied by Mr. Kendall. The letter opened the door, and the letter got Polk thinking, we don't want all of these people out there who would not support us. Well, on June 3rd then, Elder Little and Amos Kendall met with President Polk. He had read the letter and believed that the saints were good citizens. He asked if 500 or more would be willing, and get this, on their arrival in that country to volunteer and enter the U.S. Army. Doesn't want to sign them up early. He wants them to get to California and then they can join the Army. He would do something for them, but had not decided and wanted to meet with the Secretary of the Navy, and then told Little, come back tomorrow. Now, the next day, Polk recorded in his diary that the Mormons could not constitute more than 1/4 of Kearny's command, and that the purpose was to conciliate them to the U.S. He's very concerned about keeping them faithful to the U.S., and he doesn't want too many of them. On June 4th, Elder Little visited the president, but the president postponed the meeting until the next day. Interestingly enough, Polk recorded in his diary that he had a special cabinet meeting to consider the Oregon question. So he's got a war with Mexico. He needs to solve the issue with Oregon, and he doesn't need a whole group of people going out there who may not support him. So things are falling in place. Now on the 5th, June 5th, Little again visited the president, who offered the following. The Battalion of Mormons could not be received into the service of the U.S. until they reached California. They would be to the number of 500, or they would to the number of 500 be mustered into the service of the U.S. as volunteers for 12 months. Mr. Little desired to follow the emigrating party now on their way to California, and on overtaking them, have 500 of their number mustered into the service of the U.S. so that their pay might commence from that time. This proposition I declined. So Little has suggested, why don't we go recruit them now? And the president says no. And then the president said Little would receive letters from the president and from the Secretary of the Navy. It wasn't what Elder Little wanted, but it was what the president was willing to offer. On June 7th, Colonel Kane came to Washington and had dinner with Elder Little, and then he met with Mr. Kendall and with James Buchanan, the Secretary of State. And on the 8th, Colonel Kane visited with the President and the Secretary of War. And Elder Little wrote that Colonel Kane concluded to go with me to the camp and then to California bearing dispatches from the government. So Thomas L. Kane then comes to help what he can do. Now, an interesting thing about the Kane family, Thomas L. Kane's father was a judge, and you can read in the diary right at this time where Polk decides to make him the federal judge over Pennsylvania. It is said that the Kanes had at least 5 sitting presidents of the United States eat dinner in their home during their terms. So they were a very well-connected family. This connection with Thomas L. Kane was very valuable. Well, Elder Little had then called on the president. The president expressed his good feelings to our people, said he regarded us as good citizens, said he had received our suffrages and we should be remembered, and had instructed the Secretary of War to make out our papers. On the 10th, Elder Little returned to Philadelphia. On the 11th, he preached in that city. On the 12th, he took the train west to report to the leaders of the church. He was accompanied by Colonel Thomas L. Kane, and they traveled together to St. Louis, where they arrived on June 21st. Now, Kane then went down to Leavenworth to take dispatches, and Little went up to Nauvoo. Little left to go to Nauvoo. There we go. Continued on Fort Leavenworth with the military dispatches. So the results from Elder Little's visit. His letter on June 1st to the president opened the door for the battalion. But if you look at Elder Little's visit, based on what President Polk had promised, it would not have been very successful. The Saints would have to make their own way to California and would then be enlisted in the U.S. Army. There would have been no pay, no clothing allowance, and no other help from the government. If President Polk's plans were carried out as he explained to Elder Little, it's likely there would have been no Mormon battalion, because they would have made it as far as the Great Basin and not gone on. And they wouldn't have had any help to get there. But as Paul Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. So that's not what happened. And we'll add in a couple of things into the calendar here. So June 2nd is when Amos Kendall told Little that the president wanted to meet with him. And that's the day that Polk met with the cabinet and authorized Kearny to receive in the service as volunteers a few hundred Mormons who are now on the way to California. In June 2nd, in that cabinet meeting, Secretary of War William Marcy presented a rough draft of orders for Colonel Kearney. Polk recorded, upon several points, the order was modified upon my suggestion. Polk was very familiar with these orders. And so they had a discussion on them. But on June 3rd, then, when Elder Little and Amos Kendall had their first meeting with the president, the orders from the Secretary Marcy to Kearney were finalized. The decision had already been made. Referring to the Mormons, the orders state, it has been suggested that many of these Mormons would willingly enter into the service of the United States and aid us in our expedition against California. You are hereby authorized to muster into service such as can be induced to volunteer, not, however, to a number exceeding 1/3 of your entire force. Remember, Polk said a fourth. Should they enter the service, they will be paid as other volunteers. There's the sentence. Other volunteers were paid from the day that they volunteered and enlisted. So there's nothing in there that says they have to wait till they get to California. Now, we don't know the exact date that Kearney received the orders, but on June 16th, he wrote the governor of Missouri and alluded to the orders. And on June 19th, he issued orders to Captain James Allen to recruit the Mormon Battalion. Now, it's commonly thought that Colonel Kane was carrying the dispatches. He doesn't even get to St. Louis until the 21st, and Kearney already has the orders. Typically, it was taking about 12 days to get orders from Washington to get them to Leavenworth. And so if these orders were sent out on the 3rd, Kearney probably got them on June 15th or June 16th. We know he had them by the 16th because he alludes to them in his letter. So the change that made the difference. There's nothing in Kearney's orders to preclude recruiting the Mormon volunteers in the Iowa Territory. The orders just, they say that he can recruit them. Captain Allen's recruiting circular states they will receive pay and rations and other allowances such as volunteers or regular soldiers receive from the day they're mustered into service. That's what Captain Allen presented when he came to Mount Pisgah and went on to see Brigham Young. The orders from Marcy opened the door from the Mormon Battalion. So now the question, why were they different from what Polk offered Little? Now, there are lots of theories on that, and that's something historians have been talking about for 175 years, or approximately. In his excellent military history, Sherman Fleek suggests that the orders were ambiguous enough that Kearney wasn't specifically instructed. And it is true that it says in his orders that they give him discretion to make decisions as necessary in the field. That was necessary because you're 12 days from Washington, so it's nearly a month if you have a question on what I ought to do to send a letter and then get it back. And the farther you go down this trail to Santa Fe, the farther away Washington gets. So that's entirely possible that they purposely wrote them so they were not very, didn't dictate exactly what had to happen. It's possible that Marcy sat in the cabinet meeting and they had a big discussion and he wrote things down and went back and finished the orders, and that's possible too. Another theory, one that I think is interesting, is perhaps Polk knew all the time what was going to be ordered, but he didn't want Little to know. In fact, in his conversation on June 5th, after Little leaves, he tells Amos Kendall that he didn't think it was wise to tell Little about them going to California. And in fact, the orders to Kearney say that he didn't want this to be a matter of public notoriety. And so it's entirely possible that Polk knew what they were going to do, but didn't want Little to know because Little was so anxious to get out and talk to the saints and start recruiting. And Polk wanted that to come through the official channels, which was Kearney, who would get orders. Now, there's another theory for you. So what's the answer to that question? The historians are just going to have to talk about it for the next 175 years. We really don't know, but it was the change that opened the door for the Mormon Battalion. Now, on June 26, Captain James Allen arrived in Mount Pisgah to recruit 500 volunteers to join the Army. Though treated kindly, he had little success and was directed to visit Brigham Young. On July 1st, Captain James Allen met with the brethren in Council Bluffs, and they agreed that he would get his battalion. On July 5th, after visiting Nauvoo, Elder Little arrived in Mount Pisgah. Now it's interesting, that's that Captain James Allen's already been there and they're recruiting. There's no record of what he thought of the change of the agreement. He came thinking that they had to go to California, and here they are being recruited. But we know this, he helped the brethren recruit volunteers. It would be interesting to know his thoughts, but to my knowledge, we've never found any record of what he thought of that. On July 7th, Colonel Kane arrived in Council Bluffs. So he came up from Leavenworth to Council Bluffs and brought with him a letter of introduction from Jesse Little, which then allowed him to meet with the brethren. And he was there as they were recruiting the battalion. So there's a quick overview of what happened when Jesse Little went to Washington, D.C., and how it was his letter that opened the doors for the creation of the Mormon Battalion. The historical question, which still don't have answers to, but we have lots of theories. Now, after the battalion is recruited and on their way, in 1847, Jesse Little accompanied Brigham Young to the Salt Lake Valley. And there he headed the company there, and from Salt Lake, he returned back east and continued on as the mission president. In 1852, he moved his family to Utah. And then once he got to Utah, he took 2 other wives and practiced polygamy and had a total of 27 children. He served in numerous civic and church callings, including the council and presiding bishopric for almost 18 years. He also started the fire department and was a fire chief and did a number of other things. He settled Littleton, which is up in Morgan County, and he passed away in 1893 and is buried in Salt Lake Cemetery. So there's a quick overview of Jesse Little, but he really was the one who opened the door for the creation of the Mormon Battalion. Now, it was 175 years ago today, Jesse Carter Little, a 30-year-old Latter-day Saint, was journeying to Washington, D.C. to visit the president. I think that's amazing that he would go do that. His faith and his courage and his tenacity would open the door for the creation of the Mormon Battalion. That battalion would have an impact on history of the church and on the history of the United States of America. I think the story of Jesse Little is one of great faith and great courage, and I think it's particularly appropriate that in this time, as we begin the 175th, commemorating the 175th anniversary of the Mormon Battalion, that we began thinking about Jesse Little and his faith and obedience to a prophet that led him to Washington, D.C., where he opened the door for the creation of the Mormon Battalion. So those are my thoughts, and thank you for the opportunity to share them with you.